So we're continuing on sources of theology. This will be the second in our series here on theology, and then we're going to dive into some deep details related to just different aspects of theology. If you recall in our last conversation, I noted that the Reformation took place. I'm not sure if I gave the exact date of that, but history tells us on October 30th, 1517, Luther nailed those 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Castle door. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the break with the Catholic Church as a result of that, and of which we continue to see to this day. And the outplay of that, in some cases, is some history that we need to talk about as it relates to theology, and that is the rise of the classical liberalistic view, or the classical liberalism view, that was really bore as a result of the Enlightenment that took place after the Reformation and continued to unfold in the 18th century. But it truly was the result of the Enlightenment, and there would never have been the framework of fundamentalism if it hadn't been for classical liberalism. So in a lot of ways, fundamentalism is a response to liberalism. And so in the age of the Enlightenment, there was this influence of the idea of independent reason. And so this idea, separate from the scripture, that reason allows us as human beings to understand the mysteries of the world and to decide for ourselves our opinions over and against other authority structures. And those authority structures could be ecclesiastical, they could be political, or some other positional authority. Okay, there were major developments that helped transform the whole intellectual ethos of the Western world and launched this side project of modernism, of which today we're still responding to. So I would say today, a lot of people say, well, we live in a postmodern world, and I would say, yeah, in some cases, but in other cases, I think we're really just depressed modernists. Okay. Because I don't think the idea has actually worked in full, and we'll unpack that some more, okay? But in this moment, as we're looking at the rise of liberalism, there were some things that sort of went with that, and that was one of the rises of science and the rise of a changed role of philosophy, which was originally a servant of theology, and then it became a master to theology in the sense of a worldview formation. And in many ways, philosophy is still setting the theological agenda in ways I don't know that theologians always have intended. There was also the rise of self-psychology and the beginning of contact with other religions. So all of these converge together, and they give rise to this idea of classical liberalism. And in the rise of classical liberalism, there is a critique of Christian theology. And that critique includes a rationality of Christianity as against the natural religions. So some did not believe in what their traditions had said. There was a denial of the need for divine revelation. There was a denial of miracles, or in some cases, people claimed the impossibility of miracles. And then they would say, well, how can one read the Bible without the miracles? And then also the rise of biblical criticism and later doctrinal criticism, such as the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of the atonement and the reconsideration. But in many ways, the Enlightenment was perhaps the most traumatic development against Christianity. And it doesn't have to be. There's some major impact, but in this era, you have some significant leaders that need to be recognized. One of those is Immanuel Kant, another is John Locke, and another is Hume, who all of these folks have connectivity to even state colleges today and interpretive realities in those state colleges today. Okay, so I want to talk about classical liberalism and its view of Scripture and its view of revelation, because I think that's important for our conversation in this course. So I think one of the major goals of liberalism was to reconstruct Christian belief in light of all this new information, all this modern knowledge. Okay, and so there was in some ways the rejection of some authorities, and one of those was on the idea of God's immanence. And so people looked at this differently than they did in the past. So it's an important thing to sort of consider. And then there was the rise of Schleiermacher, who's the father of classical liberalism, the Protestant theology, and of Albert Rich, who was, really those folks viewed God as a collaborator as it relates to anthropology. So Schleiermacher would say things like, the God consciousness is rising in a person, where they really, in many ways, dethroned God and allowed the anthropology to rise in their philosophy of religion. And revelation then became an event. Okay, so Scripture was interpreted as a religious experience rather than a framework of everything. It became viewed as a religious experience that was written down. And so instead of doctrines or presuppositions, revelation is an event or an experience of the divine of which we can say that we have heard God speaking. Do you see how that's different than maybe the traditional view? And there was an emphasis on the human side of the Bible. And now the Bible is, in the classical liberalist view, the Bible is fallible and it needs to be interpreted at times by science in order to be intelligible to the modern reader. Okay, so inspiration in this case is the elevation of human power and the authority. There's really no binding authority in this view. The Bible is a special book. It gives us an experience. It's authoritative in its own field, but it's not authoritative in other fields of science. Okay, and there's a framework for that I think is, as relevant today as it's ever been. So there's some reflections on this area that I want to just talk about for a second. I think the basic intent of the classical liberalistic view is commendable. It's a major attempt to contextualize Scripture to modern thinkers. I think, too, that has a basic problem, and that it surrenders the revelation to a specific worldview and makes the worldview the norm of revelation. It makes human discourse and the modern view of life the primary worldview, and it puts the Bible sort of inside of that worldview. Okay? And this is the beginning of religious pluralism in Christianity that will later be sown in future generations. So it's beginning to set the table for the secular, humanistic, pluralistic structure upon which our world currently revolves. Okay? So here's sort of a quick summary of the old and the new view of Scripture in this concept. So the old view was that revelation is the divine word, and that it's just the Bible is the authority in all of these disciplines and all of these ways of viewing the world, whether it be science or art or whatever. And then in the new view, it's sort of a new expresses its interpretation for its discipline, but maybe not for the others. And it expresses and interprets humans' experience rather than the old view, which was that it's the access of truth to the world. So in the old view, God is the one who takes initiative. In the new view, there's a sense of immanentism. So everything that happens begins with humans, and this text is sort of connected to that. Okay. All right. So I think those are really key things as it relates to theology. We'll discuss some other views because I think they'll be relevant, but I really wanted to just connect on that one. Thanks.